Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Executive Director of the Pegasus Institute is on with us to take us in a little bit on the pandemic overreach, which is so acute here in Virginia, beginning with Governor Northam's proclamation of a large percentage of our citizens were non-essential. Josh Crawford, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. So let's go into this a little bit, because I think this has been what has driven so many people to distraction since the first time somebody said, "Hey, cruise ship up in Seattle seems to have had an outbreak of something." And as it became more and more acute and more people said something needs to be done to protect the citizens, we start to hear the government making more and more proclamations over your own life. And talk about the precedent it sets. Talk about the legalities of where it came from and what a citizen has in the way of due process over this.
Sure. So all 50 states give to the governor the ability to declare an emergency. And the basic thought behind that is that there may be times in which it is advantageous for the chief executive of your state, or in our cases, commonwealths, to act unilaterally quickly to get resources to a particular area without some of the burdensome regulations that would normally be in place, without some of the red tape and bureaucracy that would normally be in place. And in most instances, this was contemplated in the cases of natural or man-made disasters, right? Hurricanes, droughts, floodings, train derailments, things of that nature. And so all 50 states have these sort of authorities. And for most of American history, they've worked relatively well because they've dealt with those kinds of things that are short in duration, things that are often localized to a particular area, and they've sort of gone off without a hitch. Fast forward to COVID-19, the imagery that was coming out of Italy, the imagery that was coming out of New York City, and slowly but surely, governors all over the country begin to declare states of emergency as it relates to the pandemic. And this was unique in the ways that we've already talked about, in that it wasn't localized, it wasn't short in duration, but all of those incredible powers that come with those declarations have gone on for the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic and the declarations of emergency. And so governors in some states could suspend regulations. Governors in other states could suspend statutes entirely. Some states have protections and legislative checks on the governor after periods of time. Most states did not. Virginia and Kentucky were two of the states that did not have those sort of legislative checks. In both Virginia and Kentucky, only the governor could declare an emergency. Only the governor could terminate an emergency. Neither Virginia nor Kentucky had any sort of duration in time. Some states have 30-day, 45-day, 60-day check-ins where those declarations of emergency have to be renewed. And so all over the country, governors of both parties are operating with incredible unilateral authority, and I'm a big believer in why that is not. That's why we don't have a state to point to say, "Hey, look at this state that's done this particularly well." Because even in the states where governors have done things that I approve of and like, they've done so unilaterally. They've done so without the traditional governance process, and so it's led to outcomes that oftentimes are suboptimal.
That is, and certainly the most obvious example is the impact it had on the voting regulations in November of last year, where any variant of changes were made, often extra legislatively, often violating constitutions by using executive offices just to arbitrarily change how voting is done. And this was when I think people really started to say, hang on a second here, hang on. What does this necessarily have to do with COVID-19? Certainly the imagery of people not wanting to go into a polling place, but the grocery store was fine. started to make even people towards the center, people who are certainly rightfully afraid of a virus that might kill you, say this is starting to get a little too far. Our Attorney General here in Virginia at the onset of COVID-19 was asked for advice regarding local government, whether boards of supervisors or city councils could continue to meet via Zoom. And he initially issued an advice that said, in terms of emergency efforts, meeting by Zoom is okay, but it was wholly insufficient for public input into the legislative process. He backed down when it became clear that 15 days wasn't going to flatten the curve. But when even Mark Herring is saying, nah, you can't really just do Zoom meetings and call that public hearing, where have we lost the ability to even reach out both sides and do the right thing and just stop this nonsense?
Yeah, I often tell people that when the levees broke in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, that was an emergency. Mm-hmm. But actually rebuilding the city of New Orleans is a question for traditional governance. It's not an emergency anymore. Getting resources to folks who are displaced because of floodwaters is an emergency, but actually rebuilding is a question for traditional governance. And I think that's part of what has been blurred during this time period and the use of emergency powers is what actually constitutes an emergency. I mean, you made reference to the 15 days to slow the spread. And I think during that time period, Americans of all political stripes gave a lot of latitude to government to say, like, hey, we don't know what the deal is here. This does feel like an emergency. Do what you think needs to be done. But as time went on, and to your point about the changes in voting, it started to be like, I'm not sure that that's so related to the crisis. I'm not so sure that we're dealing with an emergency here that is unique from questions of traditional governance. And the problem is that the decisions that a lot of these governors made had real-world consequences. Here in Kentucky, at the height of the sort of stay-home orders, about 18.5% of all businesses were forced to close. Mm-hmm. Here in Louisville alone, more than 300 businesses have closed permanently. Cases of domestic violence are up across the country about 8%. Mm-hmm. Here in the city of Louisville, they were up 13%. Drug overdoses are up nationally. Kentucky had the second highest rate of increase in drug overdose deaths. And so in trying to slow the spread, in trying to deal with the coronavirus as a public health issue, these governors did a lot of things that neglected a whole lot of other areas of public policy that have caused a tremendous amount of pain. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's one of the things that folks need to be mindful of when they think about this, that the benefit to the deliberative process, the benefit to a representative legislature is that these concerns that are perhaps more localized can be raised through the traditional governance process. And that has really been lacking in this country since these declarations of emergency were first declared.
As the expression goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you have is one governor, everything that you're going to do is driven by the wants or attitudes of that one governor. And you may be blessed and have a good one. You may be blessed and not have a good one, and everything in between. And we've seen those fruits. So what has to happen? Certainly, you mentioned Kentucky and Virginia, two commonwealths where there was the blind spot, and as you said at the onset, a fairly understandable blind spot in this emergency ordinance. What needs to be done legislatively? We're a very good do tank here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy in terms of getting legislation written and passed. What do we need to be writing to get passed so that the governor can't just go on forever with his emergencies? Because I hear gun violence and climate change both getting bandied about as health emergencies similar to COVID-19. I'm thinking, hold on a second here. That's a whole different can of fish.
Right, absolutely. You're absolutely hearing those things. And look, I live in the city of Louisville. Our homicide rate has more than doubled over the last 5 years. And so urban violence is very much a problem here in the city, but it's a question for traditional governance. It's not It does not need the unilateral actions of a governor. And so what you all can do, what legislators all across the country can do, is put what I refer to as content and process limitations on declarations of emergency. And so content limitations are things like exempting from declarations of emergency certain questions of fundamental rights. So here in Kentucky, we removed the ability for governors to unilaterally dictate how worship services take place, to unilaterally restrict the right to peaceably assemble and things like that. Mm-hmm. We also put a number of process restrictions in place. So now, moving forward, any executive order that a governor puts in place under a declaration of emergency has to be ratified every 30 days if the legislature so chooses. And so if the governor puts forward an executive order that the legislature doesn't like, and after 30 days they choose not to ratify it, that executive order is no longer in place. If they ratify it, they can ratify it for another 30 days. They can ratify it for a longer period of time if they think it's particularly relevant for a longer period of time. But there is that legislative check every 30 days if the legislature so chooses. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, the governor cannot promulgate substantially similar regulations to ones that have been rejected. And so let's say that the governor puts a statewide mask mandate in place, and the legislature says after 30 days we're not interested in continuing that statewide mask mandate. The governor cannot then put out a substantially similar executive order that is effectively a statewide mask mandate. And so there's an additional procedural hurdle in place there. We've also further defined not just what constitutes an emergency, but when and how regulations and statutes can be suspended. Kentucky had a sort of very vague language in place for how and when the governor could suspend statutes and regulations. And from what I've seen of Virginia, you may have somewhat similar language. And so cleaning that up as well. And so if you put those content and those process guardrails up, it's not going to be perfect. Your legislature can just rubber stamp everything the governor does in theory, but it does create that additional layer, whereas a governor can't act unilaterally anymore for an extended period of time. And that 30 days allows for the traditional declarations of emergency, right? It allows for those flooding emergencies. It allows for those drought emergencies. It allows for those train derailment emergencies to continue as they always have.
Here in Virginia, we're visiting with Josh Crawford. He's the executive director of the Pegasus Institute out of Kentucky, where, similar to Virginia, we have issues with open-ended executive powers under states of emergency. You mentioned the 30 days being certainly sufficient. We were struck several years ago by a derecho whose length of the storm actually went from the North Carolina border up to Pennsylvania. And the storm ostensibly dragged across the state like a windshield wiper. There were power outages everywhere. You couldn't send crews from one part of the state to the other, and even that mitigated by the 30 days. So this was perhaps the most extreme weather incident I've ever seen, and we were able to be out of it within 30 days. So I certainly agree with you that the 30-day window is fair. What about bipartisanship? This, again, we've run into a place where the political climate, and I'm not saying Democrat or Republicans are to blame, but often they'll dig their heels in because our governor's a Republican and we can't vote against something that gives our guy power. But I could make the case that under a state of emergency, a Republican conservative governor could ban access to abortions, close all of the Planned Parenthoods because of a state of emergency, just as easily as a left-wing governor could shut all the gun stores down or close all the churches. So are we capable of getting bipartisan support to get some of this stuff passed?
I think so, right? I think a lot of it is going to be viewed through partisan lenses, because especially when the legislature is of one party and the governor is of another, right? There's always that dynamic. But even in states with uniparty control, like Oklahoma or California or a place like that, the question that legislators are going to have to ask themselves are you responsive to your constituents, or is only the governor responsive to your constituents, right? I guarantee legislators of all stripes are hearing back home from constituents on how things ought to be going, one way or the other, perhaps sort of more politically liberal, perhaps more politically conservative. But under this current framework, there is nothing that those legislators can do about it, whether they want to push it one direction or the other. The other thing to keep in mind is that at some point in the near or perhaps distant future, most states will have a governor of the other party, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if gun violence or climate change are appealing to you as states of emergency, what, to your point earlier about abortion as an emergency issue that requires unilateral action from a Republican governor, or vice versa? If you're a Republican state and you're a very conservative Republican and that idea is appealing to you, what about the questions of gun violence and climate change? And so this is really a question of good governance. This is really a question of separation of powers and ultimately who represents constituents in the legislative process, more so than it is one partisan ideology versus the other.
And quite honestly, not every legislator is ever going to grow up, quote unquote, to be the governor. So how much power do you want to cede from your elected office to theirs? Could be a winning argument to some, perhaps of our more shallow representative breed. But I see your point, though, because it is true, and we have to look at it that way, that in Kentucky, I know that you guys have a legislature about the same size as Virginia's, with a smaller population, and therefore I think the constituents probably feel a little closer to their representatives. Virginia, we tend to feel a little gerrymandered out because we're stretching, an 8 million person population over 140 legislators. But I think that at the end of the day, most of them are going to say, listen, we have to have some relevance here at the end of the day. Now, have you seen legislation in Virginia? I have not, from anyone that might try to put this genie back in the bottle right now.
Yeah, so my understanding is that there was conversations in Virginia. There may have even been a bill filed, but I don't know what the status of that effort is. But like I said from the get-go, Virginia and Kentucky, to begin this, looked very similar. We in Kentucky have now done a lot of the right things. I actually really think we kind of have the model piece of legislation and the model law on this now. And so in perhaps what is a rare twist of fate, it's time for Virginia to catch up with Kentucky as it relates to emergency powers.
Hey, Josh Crawford is executive director of the Pegasus Institute. Where can people learn more about your work? And we're going to also put up some links to that Kentucky legislation as a primer for folks who might be interested in that as well. But where can people learn more about the Pegasus Institute?
Yep. So you can find us at pegasuskentucky.org. That's our website. Kentucky is spelled out. It's not just KY. And then on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those places, Pegasus Institute, Pegasus KY. You can find us on all those social media platforms as well.
Well, we deeply appreciate your visit, and if you ever want to give up your day job, you can probably take over for me because you have a much better voice than I do, so I appreciate that. But I certainly couldn't do what you do. Thank you, sir, and thank you for joining us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in as well this special weekend across the United States where we take a moment and remember those who lost their lives 20 years ago this weekend, and sort of the feelings that we had come September 12th, 2001. And we have, over the last 20 years, somewhat lost the ability to say, hold it, okay, we're Americans. You can hyphenate all you want, but we're Americans. And hopefully we don't need something dire as happened in 2001 to happen again to remind us of that. Like simply the power of our oratory to do that, but somewhere in the middle we'll meet. Until next weekend, for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, my name is Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.